In the summer of 1893, 27 million people walked into a city that did not exist. It had been built in 18 months on a swamp at the edge of Lake Michigan. It had its own power grid, its own police force, its own transportation system, and its own skyline. It was cleaner than any real city in America. It was whiter than any real city in America. And when the last visitor walked out of it in October of that year, it was burned to the ground. A civilization-scale demonstration of power, constructed at enormous cost, occupied for less than a year, and then deliberately destroyed. The question nobody in any mainstream history course asks is why. Not why they built it, why it had to go. Before we get into that, let me ask you something. If you have ever stood in front of a photograph of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition and felt something you could not quite name, something closer to unease than wonder, you were picking up on something real. The official story calls it a celebration, a birthday party for a nation marking 400 years since Columbus. But celebrations do not require a 690-acre ground plan, 200 purpose-built structures, the largest electrical installation in human history at that point, and the coordinated presence of every major industrial power on Earth. Celebrations do not require that level of engineering. Power trials do. The United States in 1893 was in the middle of an identity crisis that its leaders were not going to admit publicly. Europe still held the architectural memory of civilization. London had its cathedrals, Paris had its boulevards, Rome had everything. America had 117 years of existence and a reputation, not entirely unfair, for being a nation of ambitious amateurs. What the 1893 fair was designed to do, at the level of national strategy, was end that conversation permanently. The men who planned it, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and the industrial financiers behind both of them, were not organizing a festival. They were staging a demonstration. The question was whether America could produce, coordinate, and sustain something that no European power had ever attempted on this scale, and do it faster, and do it better, and do it on a swamp. The architecture was not decorative. That is the first thing you have to understand. Every building in the White City was clad in a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fibre, painted white and made to look like stone. From a distance, from any photograph, from the memory of everyone who attended, the fair looked like a civilization that had been standing for centuries. Massive neoclassical facades, colonnaded walkways, domed administration buildings that rivaled anything in Washington or Rome. It was all temporary. Every column, every archway, every cornice was designed to last less than a year, which means the men who built it were not trying to create architecture. They were trying to create the impression of architecture. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously when you start thinking about what else might have been presented as permanent that was not. The electricity is where the demonstration becomes something harder to explain away. George Westinghouse won the contract to power the fair using alternating current, defeating Thomas Edison in a competition that was explicitly framed as a technological war. The fair ran on more electric lighting than the entire city of Chicago at that moment. The machinery hall contained engines and systems of a scale that no member of the general public had ever seen in operation. The transportation building displayed vehicles and infrastructure components that suggested a future so specifically mapped that it raises its own questions about who had already been living in that future and for how long. The fair was not showing people what was possible. It was showing people what had already been decided. There is a distinction between those two things, and in 1893, almost nobody in the crowd was in a position to see it. Every major industrial nation sent a pavilion. Every pavilion was, in plain terms, a negotiating position. Germany sent machine tools and chemical processes. Britain sent colonial goods and financial instruments dressed up as curiosities. France sent engineering and art in proportions calibrated to remind every visitor which country had given America its most recognizable monument only 7 years before. The fair floor was a map of global competition presented as friendly exhibition. The men walking through those pavilions in top hats were not tourists. They were reading intelligence. They were measuring gaps. They were deciding where capital would flow for the next generation. The labour that built the White City was not celebrated and was barely acknowledged. Construction workers died on the site. Strikes were suppressed. The same period that produced the gleaming neoclassical facades also produced the Pullman strike, the violent suppression of labour organising across the Midwest, and a national financial panic that put millions of ordinary Americans out of work. The men who funded the fair were the same men whose business practices were generating that panic. The White City was not built apart from that context. It was built directly on top of it, literally and otherwise. What Burnham and his backers were rehearsing in that 690-acre temporary city was not just architecture and electricity. They were rehearsing the mechanisms of the modern controlled city: centralized power distribution, unified aesthetic codes enforced across an entire urban space, mass movement of populations through designed corridors toward designed experiences, authority made invisible by being embedded in the environment rather than standing at the gate with a rifle. Every city built in America after 1893 carries the fingerprints of what was tested in Chicago that year. The crowd control, the lighting grids, the zoning logic, the separation of industrial function from public spectacle. It was all piloted in the White City, then the White City burned. And the blueprints for what it had actually demonstrated, the deeper systems, the source materials, the engineering specifications that did not appear in any public catalogue, those did not burn with it. The blueprints for the surface buildings exist. That is worth stating clearly before anything else, because the claim that everything vanished is not quite right, and the truth is more unsettling than the simple claim. Architectural drawings for the major fair structures are held in collections at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Library of Congress, and several university archives. You can look at them. You can order reproductions. What is missing is not the facades. What is missing is everything underneath them. The engineering specifications for the electrical distribution network, the detailed schematics for the machinery hall installations, the contract documents between Westinghouse and the Fair Committee that would tell you exactly what was installed, at what capacity, drawing on what sources, the internal correspondence between Daniel Burnham and the industrial backers whose names appear in the public record only as donors and patrons. Those documents either were never centralized, were lost in the fires that swept through portions of the fair's infrastructure in 1894, were transferred to private collections and never returned, or were never meant to survive the fair at all. All four of those explanations are plausible. None of them is fully satisfying. That tension is the point. The fire deserves its own moment. In July of 1894, almost a year after the fair closed, the casino and the terminal building burned. The cold storage warehouse had already burned during the fair itself, killing several firefighters. What the fires took was not primarily the drawings, which had already been dispersed, but the physical evidence. The staff-covered structures that had not been formally demolished were consumed, and what might have been recoverable through physical inspection became ash. Whether those fires were accidents in the way the official record says they were accidents is a question that several researchers have asked, and none has answered to anyone's full satisfaction. What is documented is the timing. The fair closed in October 1893. The labour uprisings Burnham's backers had been working to suppress came to a head in the Pullman strike of 1894. The fires came in the middle of it. A functioning 690-acre demonstration site sitting at the edge of a city full of striking workers would have been an uncomfortable artefact to leave standing. Then there is the institutional neglect explanation, which is the one that mainstream historians find most comfortable. The fair was temporary by design. The organisations that built it were purpose-created and were dissolved when the fair ended. Nobody was appointed keeper of the record. The drawings and specifications were distributed among dozens of architectural firms, engineering contractors, and government agencies with no single custodian and no coherent archiving plan. Documents that nobody is specifically responsible for preserving have a way of not getting preserved. This is how most historical records disappear, not through conspiracy, through the ordinary entropy of bureaucratic indifference applied to materials that their custodians no longer considered urgent. That explanation is probably largely true. It is also the explanation that subsequent generations found least satisfying, and you can understand why. Because what the fair had demonstrated, in that 18-month window on a Chicago swamp, was a capability that seemed to exceed the official trajectory of American industrial development. The electrical systems were too sophisticated. The construction was too fast. The coordination was too precise. When people looked at the photographic record of the White City, and then looked at what American cities actually looked like in 1894, the gap between those two images produced a question that the entropy explanation did not close. If they could do that, why did the rest of the country look the way it looked? And if the documents that would explain how they did it are gone, the question stops being historical and starts being something else. That is the door through which the larger speculation enters, and it is worth being honest about what lives on both sides of it. On one side, there is a real and documented asymmetry between what the fair demonstrated and what the official industrial timeline can account for. On the other side, there are theories that use that asymmetry to argue for suppressed civilizations, stolen technologies, and deliberate erasure of a prior global culture. The first thing is true in a way that invites serious inquiry. The second thing is an interpretation that the evidence does not yet prove, and intellectual honesty requires keeping those two things separated, even while acknowledging that the gap between them remains genuinely unresolved. What is not speculative is the pattern. Power displays, at the civilizational scale, are designed to produce a specific experience in the people watching them. They are designed to make the audience feel that what they are seeing is the natural and inevitable expression of legitimate authority. The machinery behind that experience, the supply chains, the labor arrangements, the financial structures, the engineering decisions made in rooms the public never entered, is deliberately kept off the floor. Every empire that has ever staged a spectacle has understood that the spectacle works precisely because the audience cannot see its joints. The White City was white because staff was cheap and fast and could be made to look like anything. The electrical system was dazzling because dazzle was the objective. What the men who funded it actually learned from running it, what they took back to their railroads and their banks and their city planning offices and their back-channel negotiations with every industrial power on Earth, that knowledge did not need to be archived. It was already in their hands. So here is the question worth sitting with. The real mystery of the 1893 fair is not what was lost in the fires. It is what was never meant to be found. Empires do not build monuments to last. They build them to demonstrate that they could. The blueprints that matter were never drawn on paper. They were drawn on the next century. Look at every controlled city, every managed grid, every public space designed to move crowds efficiently toward experiences that someone else selected, and you are looking at a blueprint that survived the fire just fine. Share this if that thought unsettles you. It should.